Hello everyone, I'm Asha, and today I'm joined by Gemma from the University of Huddersfield to talk about the financial struggles many teens face when entering university, how to manage these anxieties, and how to prepare for the upcoming term. Like a lot of people my age, the thought of independence and new responsibilities can be a bit overwhelming, but hopefully, by the end of today's episode, we'll all feel a bit more confident and informed. Thanks for joining us today, Gemma.
Absolute pleasure to be here.
Before we begin, would you be able to tell us a bit more on your specific role?
I'm actually a schools and colleges liaison officer, so I've got quite a long job title at the University of Huddersfield. So essentially what I do is I work in schools and colleges, mainly in West Yorkshire, and I go out and deliver talks and workshops on lots of different things to help students prepare for university. But one of those talks that I deliver is student finance, and I do talk to students quite regularly and parents as well about entering the student finance system and talk about any concerns that they might have.
So we should probably start with, how much will it actually cost me to go to university?
Okay, so I'll break that down because that is a really, really big question. There are obviously lots of costs involved in going to university. So first of all, university education isn't free. So universities charge for your education, and that is called a tuition fee. Universities' maximum that they're allowed to charge by the government is around about £9,500 a year. That has just been announced. It is going to go up slightly with inflation, but that's a roundabout figure. Universities can charge less, but I'll be honest, I haven't seen very many that don't charge the full 9,000-ish figure. And that is because that is how much it costs to educate their students. And actually, universities haven't been able to put the fees up in the last 10 years or so. That's been the absolute maximum. Okay, so obviously that is 9,500-ish, maybe slightly more per year. So you need to consider over 3 years, possibly 4 years, how much that is going to cost you in total. If you're doing a placement year, that is going to be a minimum of a 4-year course. And there are costs involved with placements as well. You will pay tuition fee, but it will be significantly lower, and that is set by the university. So that's the first type of cost, the first major cost involved in going to university. And I think that's the one that, if we're listening to the news or reading online, that's the one that everybody knows about, is this 9k figure. There is a tuition fee loan that is available from the government, which will cover that full amount. Okay, so that one doesn't depend on your household income, doesn't depend on your circumstances. That is there to cover that full cost. So whatever the university charges per year, as long as you apply, you would get a loan for that amount. And that is paid directly to the university, not to the student. So you're not going to get around about £9,000 in your bank account. That gets paid directly to the university. Okay, so that's your tuition fee, the first major cost that's involved. And then the second type of cost is obviously living costs, which depends on whether you move away from home or whether you decide to commute to university, is going to vary quite significantly based on your own personal choice. And again, that cost, there is a loan available from the government in the same way that there is a loan for your tuition fees. There is what's called a maintenance loan, and that is available to the student. So it gets paid directly to the student in 3 instalments, so once a term, and that is up to the student to decide how they spend that money. So it could go towards, if you're moving away from home, it's probably going to go towards your accommodation costs. That's going to be the bulk of the cost of moving away. If you're commuting into uni, it might go towards things like transport, but then obviously you've got things to consider like food and drink, any social activities as well, and then things like, your mobile phone, all those other costs that are associated with just living life, basically. So those are your 2 main costs, I would say.
Roughly how much would you say accommodation costs?
So it does vary again quite a lot, but on average, we would be talking around about £100 to £300 per week in student accommodation. So if you're doing your maths, university contracts don't run for a full year, so you're looking at maybe 37, on average 41 weeks per year. So that's your cost in terms of £100 to £300, depends where you're going to live. Somewhere like Huddersfield's a lot cheaper because it's not in a city. Other places do go higher than the £300, but that's on average.
So we'd be looking at about 8 to 10 grand per year then?
Yeah, I would say that that's a fair estimation in terms of what you'd be looking at for accommodation per year.
Yeah. So would you say most people pay for these costs themselves, or are there loans available that students can use?
I would say most students that I know do use the student loan system, and there are different amounts available depending on what your situation is. So there are 3 different scenarios. If you're living at home, if you are living what they term as elsewhere, which is anywhere other than London, and then you've got your London bracket as well. And there are maximum and minimum amounts depending on what your situation is. So the maximum and minimum amounts for the living cost loan do depend on your household income and your circumstances. So it works very, very differently to the tuition fee loan, which is just whatever the university charges the student gets a loan for. The living cost loan does depend on the student's household income, and that is whoever the student lives with. So it could be mum, dad, could be mum. If mum has a partner, their income gets taken into account. It could be if you live with a guardian, carers, it's whoever you live in a household with is what is considered as a household income. It can get a little bit complex, but there is a calculator online called the Student Finance Calculator. So if you just Google that, it's a government website and you can answer a few questions to get your own individual entitlement of what you would be entitled to for that living cost loan. And as I say, that is based on your household income, whether you're moving away from home or whether you're in London or not. In terms of maximum and minimum amounts, so if you were living at home, you're looking at maximum just over £9,000 a year, minimum £4,000 a year. So that is if your household income is the highest level, you would still get the £4,000. If you had a low income, then that maximum would be the £9,000. That's if you're living at home. And then it does go up, obviously. So elsewhere, it's just over £10,000, nearly £11,000. I will say these exact figures have just gone up for students entering university next year. So the figures that I'm using now are for this year. They've gone up with inflation, but they do give an example of kind of how much we're looking at. So elsewhere, the maximum amount is just under £11,000 and the minimum amount just over £5,000, and that is based on household income.
Yeah. So would you say that these student loans will be like enough to support my spending and my needs at university?
Realistically, your student loan for most students isn't going to cover the full cost of university. So that's where I support students and kind of look at different ways where you might fill that gap, if you like. So we'd start looking at other sources of income. The first place to start looking, I would say, is things that students often don't think about. So other streams of funding through universities themselves, things like government streams of funding. So for example, if you're interested in an NHS course, there are some big bursaries available for nursing, any sort of what we call allied health professions. So essentially that's anything other than medicine and dentistry if you're working in the NHS, where you can get a bursary of usually £5,000. That's the starting figure, and that's per year. And that's free money. That's not money that you pay back. That is money that the NHS are going to give you for doing that particular course. There's also extra money for things like travel costs if you're doing placements, travel expenses. If you choose a profession that they're struggling to recruit, so something like mental health nursing, there's like an extra subject specialist payment that you can get on top. And then just to give an example of other streams of funding, there is also the disability allowance, DSA, so disabled students allowance and additional needs. So again, that's something that students may not think that they're entitled to. That's not just physical disabilities, it could be any mental health disability, learning disability. It's not always cash. It might be equipment that you need. It might be a specialised laptop. It might be support that you need at university. But that is another stream of funding to look into. And then lastly, you've got things like bursaries and scholarships, which are available directly from universities. And they have very specialised criteria, shall we say. So scholarships tend to be based on academic ability. Bursaries are more based on your personal circumstances, but they do have their own, as I say, criteria, but they have their own deadlines as well. So you really need to look out for when those deadlines are. They'll be unfortunately different for every university, and they may not fall in line with the standard UCAS deadlines, the university application deadlines as well. So just some things to be aware of, really. Those are the kind of funding streams, but then you've got things like part-time work, which obviously we can talk about as well.
Yeah. So all of these like bursaries, scholarships, these all money that you don't have to pay back?
Yeah, all free money that you don't pay back.
All right. For anyone who isn't completely aware, what are the major price tags of a university lifestyle, and what are the biggest hidden costs that university students don't expect?
So I would say, in terms of this question, you probably need to look at whether you're going to move away from home or whether you're going to stay at university halls or take up private accommodation. And for students who do decide to remain at home and commute into university, which is now a very, very popular choice, around 60% of students at most universities, that's around the average figure, do commute into university. And at Huddersfield, that is even higher. We're looking at around about 70% of our students that commute. The different kind of price tags will be different depending on your situation. So for students at home, I would say number one price tag is probably going to be your transport costs. So looking at how much it's actually going to cost you to get to university. Obviously, if you live really, really close and you walk in, then it's going to be completely free. Or you might be able to cycle or something like that. So you can get creative and think out of the box. But if it's buses, trains, sometimes students don't realise how much that might cost, particularly if you are travelling across a border. So in Huddersfield, if you're travelling in from a different area, that can have a bigger price tag. So if you're within Yorkshire, you might get a West Yorkshire like Metro Pass, let's say, which you might be familiar with. Yeah. But if you're coming across from Manchester, it may cost you significantly more. So there are obviously ways that you can save money, looking out for discounts, student rail cards, student discounts on buses. But I would say travelling in from home, that's probably going to be the biggest cost.
Yeah.
And then moving away from home, so if you're going to move away for university, then top cost would be accommodation. And that can be quite complex in terms of what type of accommodation you're looking at. Is it a hall of residence, which is generally run by the university? Whether there don't tend to be hidden costs, so it tends to all be part of the package, which is quite good. So you're not having to think about bills or things like that if you're going to go for halls of residence. But if you move into private accommodation, you would be looking at, all your kind of gas, electricity, water, managing all of those bills. So it is a little bit different. And then little things like food costs. Obviously, they have gone through the roof, astronomical. Parents will be more familiar with this, but if you're not used to buying your own food, then working out a weekly budget in terms of how much your food is going to cost. And then thinking about your academic studies, so this would be for both home and away students. Things like printing, you do have to pay for printing at uni. And any sort of course costs that might be involved. So depending on the course that you're doing and the university that you go to, there could be equipment that you need that may not be included in the course itself.
How much do these equipment costs tend to vary?
Can really, really vary. Yeah, so I probably couldn't put an exact price on it. It just depends on the course and the university. So it could be anything from as much as a small contribution, let's say £20-30, to much, much higher.
Yeah. And I remember when I first learnt about the hidden costs of university and finding out washing, for example, you had to pay for in like laundrettes and it was like £3 a cycle. Yeah. Is there any other hidden costs like that?
Yeah, that's a really good example. So as I mentioned with student halls, most of your costs are included, so all of your bills are included, but things like your laundry, you do have to pay for. There's also things like we would recommend that you have insurance. So things like, obviously you might have a laptop, any sort of high ticket items that you might take to university, you would need to get insurance for. And there are companies that specialise, and universities will recommend, obviously, when you join, which ones are specialised for students. They're a little bit cheaper, but you would need to consider insurance. That does tend to be quite a small cost every month. but it will change over time. It will be getting more expensive, so that's definitely something to look into. TV license, that's always a big one with students. Shall I get a TV license or not? I'm not going to go into the rules of that because I don't work for the BBC, but if you're watching, I think it's live TV, you would need one.
So I was just wondering, as you said earlier, there's two different choices. You can kind of live on campus, live off campus, or you can commute. What would you say, how costs vary between living on campus and off campus?
So obviously, if you live on the campus or very close to the campus in student halls, there's convenience. So you're not having to think about how you're going to get to university. Is there a cost involved? Even if you're moved away from home, there might still be a cost involved if you're not living on the campus. If it's student halls, again, like I said, everything would be mostly included in the price. So things like your bills. You would, as I said earlier, need to look at things like, Wi-Fi, insurance, TV license, like gym membership. Sometimes they're included, sometimes they're not in your halls of residence. If you live off campus, more in private accommodation, then it does vary depending on that provider. So each provider will be different in terms of what they offer their students, because essentially they're a business and they will all be quite different. So some will have sort of social spaces. Pretty much all accommodation that I know of at the moment, especially in Huddersfield, is en suite. So we're not looking at sharing bathrooms. That might be different nationally. I think there are still some universities that in their halls of residence you have a shared bathroom, but I think that is phasing out.
I know at the University of York, a lot of their halls of residence have shared bathrooms.
Yes, there is that factor to consider. But most likely you'd be in a flat setup where there's 6 rooms that share a kitchen and potentially a social space. I think social space is quite important when you're looking at accommodation, because if you're all just in your bedrooms and you've only got a kitchen, then certainly when I was at university, we just used to hang out in the kitchen, which is fine. But if you want to watch TV, we'd all be sat in a really tiny room all crammed on someone's bed to watch something together. So I think that's probably something that a lot of students maybe don't think about. So certainly something that I thought about when I was looking at universities is where am I going to hang out? So social space is important. I would say private accommodation is better at that than university-owned. University-owned accommodation tends to be quite functional, I'll be honest, which is where you get your shared bathrooms, but might be cheaper. Private accommodation's more likely to have higher standard, more your mod cons, so it might have like a games room, a social space with a pool table, a TV area for you to sit and watch, might have a gym. So that is because it's run by the private sector and that is what they do, and the universities are mainly in it for education, and then they kind of have their accommodation tacked on, if you like, in a way. So all accommodation in Huddersfield is privately owned. The university don't own any accommodation, and such as the accommodation is really good, really high standard.
So as you said earlier, talking about part-time jobs, would you say it's beneficial or would you say it's quite overwhelming for students?
I think it's a very personal decision. Personally, I would say any part-time work is going to enhance your CV, your employability. It's probably about finding something that's suitable to you, the student, and your studies. At Huddersfield, we don't recommend that students work any more than 15 hours per week. If you take up a job through the university, so maybe something like working in the Students' Union or in one of our shops, or if you took on a student ambassador role, you physically can't work more than 15 hours a week. It just gets stopped by HR or payroll. But you can obviously supplement your income by working in retail. Lots of students work in supermarkets or shops as well, and you've got more freedom in terms of what hours you work as well. So in reality, most students do work part-time to fill that gap where the student loan doesn't cover, but there is an expectation in terms of how the system works that parents will contribute, and that is why the household income is the deciding factor. So essentially the assumption by the government is that the higher your parents earn or the household earns, the more they will be able to contribute to you going to university. And as we know, or as I know from my conversations with students, that is not an option for many, many students for their parents to contribute, because there are obviously so many other things that parents do need to contribute. As well, it might be other children in the household. And particularly with the cost of living rising, that just is becoming less and less of an option. So I think that's why it's important to have those conversations early on with your parents, and maybe go online, look at the finance calculator, and you just answer a few questions, sit down with your parents and see what your individual entitlement would be for that living cost loan, and then look at how much is it going to cost and how would I make up that shortfall.
And yeah, I think that's especially important when you talk about the fact of, earlier when we calculated it, it was about 8 grand to 12 grand per year, and the lowest maintenance loans were 5 grand. So I think that's quite important in the fact that you can't really expect these students to pay for universities themselves if it's 3 grand a year that isn't even accounted for accommodation alone.
Exactly, and that's why commuting to university has become a more popular option, because obviously it is cheaper and there is less cost involved.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's important to look at all of these costs, but then also look at all the different streams of funding that are available, and just arm yourself with all the facts and all the knowledge. It is quite overwhelming. I would highly recommend having a look at Martin Lewis Money Saving Expert website. So he breaks down all the figures that I've talked about, particularly if you're interested in interest. So what is charged on the loans, he breaks that down in really simple terms. And also repayments, so you can look at interest rates for student loans, and you can also look through the forums in terms of, is it advisable for me to take out a student loan? Lots of people do ask me that question. If they might be able to afford full cost of uni, maybe if they're living at home, should I take out a student loan anyway? Or the big question is, should I pay my student loan off? Got a really high paying job now. Should I actually just pay it off as a lump sum? So there are questions like that in there that you can research and have a look at. The other website I'd recommend is the Student Room. So that is a website which has lots and lots of information on. Started out as a chat room, got lots more on it now. And different universities and the Student Finance England, they finance all the loans. It's a government-owned company, so they look after all student loans in England. They often host on there as well, so you can talk directly to the people who are giving your loans. We've talked about student loans. By the nature of the word loan, they are a loan which the government has a system for students to pay back. And I'll just go through it really, really quickly. So the way it works is that currently, when the student has graduated, finished university and is earning over £25,000 a year, the repayment kicks in through the tax system. So the student doesn't have to make any arrangements to pay the loan back, and it just comes directly out of the student's wage, a bit like a tax. If the student or graduate income falls below £25,000, the repayments stop. So lost your job, you're unable to work, then the loan repayments stop. It's not like a mortgage, so it doesn't affect your credit rating. It's not like a credit card or a car loan that we might be more familiar with, that you have to keep paying off whether you can afford it or not. It does kick in and out as to when you can afford it. And in terms of the amounts that you pay back, this can sound quite complicated, but essentially you pay 9% of any income that is over £25,000. That is the current threshold amount. So you're not paying 9% of £25,000, you're paying 9% of anything that's over that amount. So if it's £26,000, you're £1,000 over the threshold, so you pay 9% of £1,000. So in real terms, if you were earning £30,000, which is £5,000 over the threshold, you'd be looking at £37 a month. £35,000 a year, you'd be looking at £75 a month, and obviously it goes up the more that you earn. There isn't any consequence if you don't pay the loan off, so the current loan term is 40 years. So if you don't pay it off in 40 years, that's just what happens. The government have designed the system that way, and they have accounted for the fact that many, many students won't pay the loan off.
So as we're coming to the end now, what main pieces of advice would you give to prospective students?
I would say do as much research as you can. Arm yourself with the facts and the knowledge about how student finance works, what's it going to cost. So look at fees, look at loans, fill out the online calculator, look at those hidden costs. What is it going to cover and how am I going to make up that shortfall? I think there are a lot of misconceptions around finance in university in terms of, I just won't be able to afford to go, and actually maybe there's more money available than you thought. But then it also works both ways. Maybe students go into it a little bit blindly and don't realise about those other hidden costs that we've talked about today. So if you've got as much information as you can in front of you, look at the websites that I've recommended and you have those conversations with your parents or whoever you live with, then you can make that informed decision about whether you should go to university, if it's financially viable option for you, or it can help you with that decision around moving away or staying at home as well.
And then for students who are already at university, obviously students that have just arrived in 2025, they're one term in. So where would they be able to find support at universities?
Yeah, universities have lots and lots of support. They're like mini towns, really. Obviously, it depends on each university. But for example, at Huddersfield, we're an example of quite a large university. So we have a student finance office where they offer sort of one-to-one appointments and advice. We also have a wellbeing team. So you can speak to the wellbeing team about any issues that you might be having, whether it be mental health issues or money issues. You can speak to someone to get support there as well. So there's always someone on hand at the university, whether it's through your academic studies or through anything that might be affecting your studies as well. And there are lots of initiatives through the Students' Union, so that's another place where you can go and speak to people. The Students' Union is a charity that is set up by students, run by students for the welfare of the students. So it is run separately to the university. So if you want let's say, a bit more impartial advice, you can access that through the Students' Union as well.
Thank you very much for helping me feel more comfortable towards my next university adventures, and I really appreciate your time with me today.
It's been really enjoyable. Thanks ever so much for having me.
You can find lots of interesting podcasts on a variety of subjects by exploring the useful podcast section on the Destination web app. Search destination.org.uk. You can also find them on Apple, Spotify or YouTube. If you'd like to know more information about student finances and costs, please check the podcast description. Finally, I'd like to thank Jimmy for editing and Youth Social for producing.